Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, together with my co-host, Mark Ronages, Statewide News Service, jbiztechphilly.com, and as you can see here, columnist for the Jewish Press.
Right, I'm having a lot of fun doing all of that. My column is called The Albany Beat, and I write about how government relates to the Jewish community, or doesn't, as the case may be.
Right.
So when we talk about government and we talk about solar energy, and energy in general, I mean, which the Jewish community is very concerned about. Our guest fits that bill beautifully. Bill Reinhardt, who's an Albany County legislator from Bethlehem, former Bethlehem Town Board member. Welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's, I mean, I was looking back on your background, and you grew up or were born in Palo Alto, California, which is obviously like a green capital. The green must have been in your blood at the time, and all the green issues. And then you went to Palo Alto High School, and then you came to New York to go to Cornell.
Yep.
And that's all part of that liberal bent that you have also. So tell us about your experience at Cornell.
Well, Cornell was a place where I kind of figured out what I wanted to do with my life. I saw it as a beautiful place, but also, obviously, for anyone who's been there, or in my case also, I had a son who went there. It's intellectually quite challenging, and that's good. It's good to be challenged. In fact, I have to make a little Cornell joke, if you don't mind. My son bought my wife a shirt from Cornell that says on the back of it, where your best hasn't been good enough since 1876. And it was I think on the front it said Chemical Engineering Department. And that is kind of the way Cornell is. It's very challenging intellectually.
So was this Seth who went there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And but in terms of my own perspective, as you said, I came from California, and actually, I have to say that in the 60s, late 60s, when I left the Bay Area, every time I came back from Cornell, I would see the air getting dirtier and dirtier. Oh. And because of all the suburban sprawl that was going, and the growth going on in the Bay Area. So even though I had lived there and enjoyed all of the wonderful natural resources that were in the Bay Area, I then, by leaving and coming back, I could see kind of the erosion of air quality and the problems of excess growth that can occur. And that was one reason why I wanted to study city and regional planning and try to understand, are there rational growth models that can control the air pollution, control the water quality issues, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is a lot of what I ended up studying in graduate school.
And that was a big deal when you were on the town board.
Oh, yeah.
For you, the growth and the planning for it.
Yes.
You can have good growth and you can have bad growth.
Again, you're the scientist, I'm not, but usually you hear that the air quality has been getting better. They say in New York City there used to be all the smog, and yeah. I mean, they say that's what I heard.
Oh, no, it's true.
It's
true.
Better.
It's true.
It just might have been Palo Alto that was getting, the Bay Area and Palo Alto was getting worse.
It was getting worse. And at that point, it was getting worse everywhere because of cars. Right. And this is just before we put on the catalytic converters and the other pollution control technologies. Once that happened, cities got a lot cleaner because the problems of ozone and automobile exhaust were radically changed for the better once we required Detroit to put on those pollution controls. Likewise, in some of the eastern cities especially, where you had a lot of coal burning, places like Pittsburgh with the steel mills and other places, if you ever get to Pittsburgh and you go to a museum and you look, there's this famous restaurant that was an old railroad station. I went there with my daughter for she has cerebral palsy. It was a technology conference for people with cerebral palsy and communication difficulties. There was a railroad station converted to a restaurant, and they had pictures of Pittsburgh every decade. And you could see, you couldn't see the air in like 1940s, 1950s. Pittsburgh was incredibly dirty. And then when they started cleaning up their emissions, not just the cars, but also the industrial emissions, things got a lot better. And one way that we've done that in the past, and again, I'm talking tailpipe here or smokestack here, it's converting from coal boilers to oil boilers to natural gas boilers. Each of those has an improvement in terms of certain emissions, especially particulates.
So much natural gas today. I mean, what are we up to today? I mean, where do we need to improve? I mean, just in natural gas, and we're flooded with natural gas with the fracking. I mean, there's enough for 100 years.
I want to be very explicit here. I'm talking history, and what I think now we have to do is we have to get off natural gas as much as we can as well because of the methane emissions that come from natural gas and the CO2. Whether you're burning coal, oil, or natural gas, you're still emitting CO2. And that is the climate challenge of our generation, is addressing the greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon emissions, but CO2 is the carbon emission that comes from burning the fossil fuels. But the methane is the emission that comes from the fracking. And that's why I am not a supporter of fracking. Because, for example, we're talking about how urban air quality has improved.
Right.
There are parts of northeastern Pennsylvania where the fracking is happening, where the air quality there is worse than it is in New York City. Because of the methane emissions and certain other hydrocarbon emissions that come from the fracking process. So even though it's a, basically it's a rural area, with the exception of the fracking activities, largely, it's got dirtier air now in some measures, like benzene and some of the other hydrocarbons, than the city of New York.
Well, how about North Dakota? I mean, do you have any, because that's where a lot of the fracking.
Well, that's where the oil, that's where the Bakken oil comes from. Bakken is the field in North Dakota. And yes, that's fracking for oil. In northeast Pennsylvania, it's fracking for natural gas. They're both fracking because all the easy stuff has already been taken out of the ground. The easy oil, the easy gas, the stuff that was under pressure, so when you punch a hole in it, like on the Beverly Hillbillies, it just comes out, it comes out on its own. That doesn't happen anymore. Well, actually, it can still in the Gulf of Mexico in some cases. And the deep reservoirs under deep bodies of water still are under pressure, but typically on land, all that stuff has already been extracted. So the easy oil, the easy gas, the easy fossil fuel has already been pulled out. But in the case of the Bakken, there one of the things they do is they flare the methane when they have impurities that for whatever reason they can't either it's impurity issues or it's just that the gas isn't the value. What their value for the developer or the energy producers there is the oil. So they either can flare off the gas, which means pure methane, which is the worst possible thing, or they burn it, converting it to CO2. So the greenhouse implication is not quite as bad. But you're still just wasting those BTUs. You're heating up the air. And in fact, when you fly over the earth at night, North Dakota shows up like an urban area because of all the flaring of natural gas.
Oh my gosh.
What would you like to exchange it with? I mean, if there's you don't like natural gas, what's the next step?
Well,
this
just
is a
so
good
happens,
segue.
I am an advocate of using solar much more
Maybe
intensively
show it
than
up
we
a
do.
little more, maybe. I don't know
Give
if
it to
we
me.
can-
Give it to me.
Okay.
Yes.
So solar and other renewables are really the way we have to make our investment in new energy
You see it
supply
comes out, people see it.
is that. And it doesn't mean that, starting tomorrow we stop driving cars fueled by oil or natural gas, or that we stop heating with oil or running factories with natural gas. What it means is, for the future, we have to invest in the non-carbon, non-methane, non-greenhouse gas generating energy sources. Otherwise, we're all doomed. I happen to believe that the scientists, 97, 98, 99% of them say climate change is a serious problem that we have to do something about. I happen to agree with that. And the way we can do that is by now going forward, we don't develop those, what some people call the extreme fossil fuels of the Bakken or the northeastern Pennsylvania gas, where you have to do the fracking. And you basically are risking water supply, pollution issues, the so-called net energy of it, or the energy return on energy investment now for these fossil resources is way less, in other words, bad, compared to what was in the beginning of the fossil age. For example, with oil, you could take 1 barrel of oil energy to get you 100 barrels of oil, useful oil, okay? Well, now that ratio is not 100 to 1, it's 1 to 7 or 7 to 1. So you get 7 barrels of oil out of the expenditure of 1 barrel of oil because of all that pumping you have to do to pressurize the resource, all the extra refining you have to do for some of these resources because they're dirty, like the tar sands. It's not even really oil yet chemically. So it takes a lot of extra energy to make it into a refined product like gasoline or heating oil. So that all is working against us. The energy return is getting worse and worse. The renewable energy, it's not going to run out. It doesn't have the same environmental risks. And it's not going to create the greenhouse problems.
Are there some people that like to plug in cars? I mean, you're an advocate of that? I mean, the electrical cars?
Yeah, that's really the direction. That's the direction we have to go.
Do you drive an electric car?
Only I have a hybrid that is not a plug-in hybrid yet. My Prius is a 2007. So as long as I'm using that, I'm saving energy because you're not manufacturing a new car for me. That's actually kind of one of the hidden benefits of extending the life of vehicles, is that 1/10 of the vehicle energy use in its life is to make it. A lot of that energy, I mean, we all think about we consume the energy as we drive, but one of the challenges of growth is that new buildings consume a whole lot of energy just to be built. Likewise, the car, just to be built. It's not just the energy we consume once, you know, to heat it.
It's everything that goes in, all the energy that goes into building, the building or the car or whatever.
Right. And so, you know, at NYSERDA, one of the things I looked at was hydrogen vehicles. I was involved.
What were you at NYSERDA? You were a project engineer?
I was in the industrial R&D department, and one of my projects was, or several projects were hydrogen projects. I headed up that program.
So is this what your degree is in engineering? Or?
No, actually, I pass as an engineer, but I don't have an engineering degree.
You're not a PE?
No, I had a social relations background at Cornell.
Social relations?
Social relations. It was like an independent major.
No wonder you're in politics.
That's right. It was an easy transition because, yeah. Anyway, so I studied that, and then at Rutgers I studied city and regional planning, where I basically studied transportation planning, land use planning, physical planning, as opposed to the social side of planning, if you will, because I'd already studied a lot of the social relations issues and some of the environmental issues at Cornell. So I knew that I wanted to understand how the shape of cities affects energy use, pollution, as well as issues of environmental justice and poverty and things like that. So that's how, for me, city and regional planning brought all that together. And even at Rutgers, I created an independent major where I focused on energy issues as they relate to planning functions. So I understood very well the energy intensity of cities, both the benefits and the risks in terms of how much energy
One
we use.
of the problems, though, is like, even though we're saying that the United States is getting better and better, you say the air is getting better, and you say the water in certain places, like Lake Erie used to be so polluted, now it's not so bad. But you got places like China, they're saying, which, you know, it's a world community. I mean, air is air. It's going to flow eventually all over the world. I mean, it's terrible pollution, and I don't know what they're doing about it.
This is one of the big challenges when I talk about sustainability, and I talk about what can we do in the town of Bethlehem, where I was involved in that issue, or what can we do for the county, where I'm now involved. We alone can't solve these problems. These are global problems. Just like climate change is a global problem. Most of our biggest environmental challenges now are global. And frankly, it's because the size of our population has grown so high, the economic development going on around the world. These all have created global challenges. And why do I care about that at the local level? It's because every level of government has to be engaged in this issue, or we will not solve it in time. And so, yes, China has to do more. Do you know that China is now the leader in solar technology? They're the leader in going green. They have stopped building their new coal plants. Now they're building solar plants. And they are doing a lot to be more efficient. Having said that, if the world were all to develop to our standard of living and our style of living, we're toast. the climate change would become insurmountable if everybody tried to adopt the Western style of living with, 2 cars and a big house and all of that. So that's the real sustainability challenge. How can we be much more efficient? How can we get our electricity from renewables instead of from dirty fossil fuels? There would not be enough fossil fuel, even with fracking, to give everybody in the world our standard of living. The peasant in India uses 1/1000th of the electricity or energy that you and I typically use as an American on an annual basis.
I'm just saying invention is a product of necessity. I mean, just like fracking, and I read that, it was just like unheard of. I mean, they didn't even think they could do it. And then it came up on the scene. So maybe, like I say, if people, I'd like people to have a higher level of living, like you say, living in a hut, and you're saying, well, it's not sustainable, but maybe people find a way to find, like you're just talking about solar energy, which is free. It's in the air, and if you can find some way, I don't know if I would do the invention, I would produce it, make $1 billion.
That is part of the answer. If you adopt the solar, and if you develop the wind resources, like offshore wind and onshore wind, that can provide all of the, especially wind. If you look at the whole country of America now, I'm not talking about the world, although I think there probably are people who would say this is true for the world as well. After all, we are the most energy intensive country in the world, and if we can do it, why not the rest of the world? We could provide all of our electricity with wind power, all of it. The challenge is how do we get that power from where the wind blows to where the people need it? And there is an answer to that, actually. If we had a national grid, not the utility, national grid, but if we had a grid that covered the whole country, and we had high capacity transmission lines, let's say along the railroad right-of-ways crossing the country, which has been proposed by engineers, we could take power being produced in the middle of the country, in the Midwest where there's so much wind, or offshore, like off Long Island, where there's a tremendous amount of wind potential, or in the West, where there's tremendous wind potential. And by the way, the wind is blowing somewhere almost all the time, night and day. So you could actually produce enough power and transmit it through the national interconnected grid to satisfy all of our loads. And now you've gotten away from the issue of, well, renewables are intermittent, right? The sun only shines during the day, blah, blah, blah. Well, batteries is part of the answer, but a national grid designed to do this, which is not what we are dealing with now, could actually solve this issue.
You're talking about the windmills? Because those are a little bit ugly when you go out. I go out to Maine, and all of a sudden you see on the ocean these windmills.
One person's art is another person's...
I actually... See, I think windmills are attractive, and it's because what do they represent? They represent a sensitivity to the planet, to the needs of the future, and not just for us, but future generations. So it means when I see a windmill, I'm saying that's going to keep the environment cleaner for my children and grandchildren, 2 of which are now in town, which is really neat. And it means we're going to preserve the planet, the environment, and it means there's a future for the future generations.
And you don't really see them. I went down to Atlantic City several years ago, and all of a sudden, I drove down where the casinos were, and coming back, I noticed these huge windmills. I'm like, when did that happen? I drove down, I didn't see them. Coming north, I saw them, Well, and they were there. If you don't notice them, but on Long Island, they're upset because that would destroy their vistas that they want to protect.
That is an
so
issue,
much, so.
and I don't want to sound like I'm being too nasty towards the Kennedy family, but when they talk about being green, and then off of Nantucket, there's going to be a windmill that's going to look the size of your thumb in the distance,
and they don't want that.
And they don't want that. They don't want the aesthetic insult of looking at something the size of your thumb out in the ocean. Well, I say no, that's wrong. If you argue that you should have renewable energy future, you should be willing to accept that. I do. And frankly, what's the alternative? The alternative is more pollution, climate change, flooding all our cities. So that nice place on the beach where you're worried about that thumbprint of the windmill, you're going to be underwater in 50 years. Florida's going to be underwater in 50 years. I've gone down to Miami every year for many, many years with my daughter for biofeedback treatments for her disability. And I walk across the Venetian Causeway to Miami Beach, and I see the water is so close to all of these multi-million dollar homes. Those homes are going to be worth nothing.
And then the gators will take over.
That's right, and they'll all be, every swimming pool will have a gator in it. And it's a tragedy that we are not recognizing this as a challenge.
This is a 40-year problem. We haven't recognized this potential for 40 years.
It's been a long time,
and
yes.
you know what,
yes,
really
remember Jimmy Carter talked about
right.
the need for this.
Absolutely, and geothermal. He was very big on geothermal,
yeah.
Jimmy Carter. And that's just digging down to get that energy up from the center of the earth, as they say.
Here's something I found out when I was preparing a talk I gave on renewable energy a couple years ago. It was after I retired from my CERTA, and I gave a talk at Union College. And I found this fantastic chart. It shows the geothermal potential in West Virginia, because there are hot rocks under the Appalachian Mountains. You have to drill a ways, right? But we know how to drill.
That's true.
We know how to drill because of the oil industry.
That's right.
Think about it. Taking all that technology that we've used to get that oil that's harder and harder to get, we have to go deeper and deeper. We could easily drill down to the hot rock.
Right.
So we're taking a dirty technology, if you will, right, for drilling oil, and we could drill into the hot rocks in West Virginia. And here's the number that I wanted to mention. There's more thermal energy potential in the hot rock under the mountains of West Virginia than there is coal. So you think of, oh, well, West Virginia is a coal state. Yeah. There's actually more renewable energy in West Virginia.
Well, you'd be happy to know that the Albany Library on New Scotland Avenue branch, the Bach Library, is part geothermal. They did have some geothermal in there. That's just as a note, but I really want to go on to a couple of other topics, because you are an Albany County legislator, and we haven't gotten to that part yet. How much of, which committees are you on in the county legislature?
I'm on the Elder Care Committee, and I'm on the Conservation Committee, which basically deals with
energy.
Well, it's not energy conservation per se. We don't really have an energy committee. We should.
Yeah, well,
I think we should.
You should. You should propose that.
Yeah. Well, if I can, you know, influence the right people, then maybe that'll happen.
Okay. Well, I'm counting you. That'll make a difference, you know. But when you ran for county legislature, you unseated an incumbent.
Correct.
I mean, that was pretty tough to begin with. That doesn't normally happen in this county.
No.
Why did you decide that you needed to do that?
Well, for me, there were the two biggest issues, which were the major issues that I campaigned on, and I think it worked.
Okay.
Was I talked about sustainability and energy issues, as you know. This is obviously key to me. And I talked about reform, meaning political reform.
Yeah.
I've been involved in political reform in Bethlehem, and I got overwhelming support in Bethlehem because the voters in Bethlehem support that. And so when you looked at where my votes came from in the election, I did extremely well in the Bethlehem district.
Well, you only won by 28 votes.
That was the primary.
That was the primary, okay.
I won by 350 votes in a three-way race in the general election, because Herb Riley ran again on a third line, on the independence line.
But what was he doing that you couldn't convince him to take on your platform? I mean, that he was just ineffective? I mean, it doesn't sound like you ran a negative campaign against Herb Riley. It sounded like you ran a positive campaign of here's what I could do. Right.
I talked about the green stuff, and I talked about the political reform, and I think there was a lot of...
It's very difficult to unseat an incumbent when you don't campaign and say, well, this is what he's not doing, or this is what he's doing wrong, and I could do better.
Well, if I was to try and say, okay, how would that have factored into the race, it would be that I think Herb Riley was identified with the traditional county legislature. You know, he'd been there for a long time, and if you wanted to reform the legislature, Herb Riley I think for some voters was viewed as somebody who's been there. He's part of the problem, not part of the solution if we want changes at the, in the legislature. So I think for some people that was an issue.
So did you, so are you part of this reform coalition that has perked up in the legislature? That
Yes.
I guess, okay. So how many people, about 10 legislators part of that reform coalition?
No, I'd say there's
6?
There's actually more than that.
More than 10.
It was both Democrats and Republicans who wanted to see reform.
What would be the major issues, though?
But are you going to be setting up like the state Senate has with the Independent Democratic Coalition? Are you going to set up a third conference?
I don't think we're going to set up a third conference. We still communicate with each other. There are issues where the Reform Dems and the Reform Republicans still feel that we can do more. But I do want to say this. I want to give credit to the current leadership for doing a couple things which had not been done before the election and have been done since. For example, when I served in Bethlehem, we had a very good thing going where we would videotape all of our meetings. Right. They were available on the web. Some of them were on the Bethlehem public TV channel. Mm-hmm. But you can also see them on the website if that's your choice. And I've even found it useful for myself to go back and look at proceedings from several months earlier to see, okay, exactly what was said, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So it's an information source, and it also kind of helps people be more, there's more transparency. Mm-hmm. So we had that in Bethlehem, and now the county legislature has done the same thing, pretty much. Not exactly the same in terms of all the technologies involved, but things are videotaped, and they're available now. So we have more transparency than we had before. I think it's because of the campaign and because of the expression of the public that, yeah, we like this. We think we should have this. And so the county has adopted it. And so we do have more transparency. So that's a good thing that's happened.
What other things in reform, when you say you'd like to reform, what would be the major issues?
Well, to me, the biggest issue is, at this point in terms of reform, at the county level, not the state level. The state level, I'd probably say the LLC loophole. Yeah. But at the county level, I think we need, as we were arguing before the election, we need to put the Charter Review Commission recommendations before the public. And they should have an option, a chance to vote on all of them. Not the version that was voted down, which I called a sham during the campaign, because it was, some from column A, some from column B. In other words, it was some of the things that were in the original charter reform that the nonpartisan group came up with. But then other things were removed, other things were changed. I think we should give the voters the chance to actually vote on all of those measures. Now, to me, an interesting question is, should it be everything up or down? So downsizing, for example, or the size of the legislature, which I campaigned in favor of, is one of the controversial issues that even not all the reformers can agree on. For example, a minority community is very concerned about downsizing because they just won, the court victory that gave them better representation because they'd been discriminated against for so many years.
And then a white Jewish guy won the seat.
Yes. Sam Fine, who you're referring to, he worked very, very hard.
Which upset members of the black community.
Well, it did.
And they did say this should have been our seat. They did say, one legislator did say that. So.
I have heard that. And all I will say is Sam worked very hard.
Yes, he did.
Well, people had their
choice.
Yeah. I mean, I think it might have been
ironic.
It might have been a three-way race, and that always makes things more interesting when you have a three-way race. Right. Which I had a three-way race, and it was very interesting because it's hard to predict, what's going to happen in that kind of situation. But so the charter reform is, I would say, that's the number one.
I do want to point out one other thing you're interested in and you're involved with is the Friends of Bethlehem Parks and Recreation.
Yes.
Okay, so you are the vice president?
I'm the vice president of that. That came out of really when John Clarkson, fairly new to the job as supervisor, he set up the budget advisory teams back in 2012, or budget advisory team, and I joined that effort. That's really how I was introduced into the local politics, was getting involved in that. And out of that, it was suggested by one of my committee buddies, Joan Gavrilik, who served on the Parks and Recs subcommittee.
Who's now president.
Yeah, she's president. And I told her when the idea was first floated, I said, yes, I'd be happy to join and support that, because that's a way to enable the town to get better use of its public resources in supporting our wonderful park system.
And it fits in with your green creds.
It fits in with that. In fact, one of the things we're hoping to get started soon is out of the comprehensive planning process, the master planning process for the town park system. One of the suggestions that was made was to look at a community garden. And I'm hoping that we will be able to move forward with that idea, which I'm a big supporter of.
Just to point out, Alan Lobel, who's a member of the Jewish community, is the secretary of the group.
Yes, Alan is another...
Put in the Jewish connection.
That's right, why not? You know? It's the only Jew on the board, and he's in the administration. Well, he's not treasurer.
Alan is a wonderful member of that committee.
Yes, I know his wife.
Bill, you know, we're out of time. There's so much to talk about, and you'll have to come back in with solar energy, where that's going, and obviously the Albany County Legislature, and there's so many things happening. But in the meantime, you're doing good work, and keep on going with a lot of success and good health.
I'm always happy to talk about Solarize and sustainability.
Okay,
thank you for having me.
Thank you.